Hi everybody, welcome to Dr. Manny's YouTube Learnshops. What we look at this time is social stratification, but this is part 2. Part 1 previously seen. Our learning objectives or outcomes for this session are that you'll be able to identify social classes in Malaysia, describe stratification in the global system, define social mobility, identify different types of social mobility, and explain social mobility in a Malaysian context. Let's review. Social class. This is one of the major systems of social stratification. And so social stratification is based on possession of money and material assets. A major characteristic of the class system is that it allows social mobility, or movement up and down the class ladder. Class position in Malaysia depends on political connections and family money. You reflect on it. Because again, this may be a topic that you may have to discuss in your written and or your seminar presentation. Here are some questions. Malaysian social class, specialised skills. Have a look at the images. Who is a higher social class? And it doesn't have to be Malaysian. This can be related to any country. Who do you think? When it comes to English speaking skills, who has a higher social class in Malaysia? And the answer is your answer. As long as you've got a reason why. Overseas education. Who do you think would have a higher social class? Technology consumption. Which device demonstrates a higher social class? Driving car, the motor vehicle that you own. Who would be seen as having a higher social class? When it comes to wearing fashionable clothing, who is considered in the images to have a higher social class? Wearing of jewellery. Who's got the higher social class? Skin colour. Who would be considered to have a higher social class? Occupation. Who has the higher social class? Your opinion. Not my opinion, your opinion. I admire both. Being able to build something is just amazing. Caring for patients compassionately, effectively, amazing. But who has the higher social class? When we look at Malaysian social class, which social class do you think that you are in? And then consider what that means. Are you upper middle, lower middle, working poor, underclass? Look at the terms. This is considered to be upper capitalist class. Monthly income in Malaysia exceeds 29,000. And typically this is reserved for politicians, powerful executives, celebrities. Why you have to steal from the people then, I don't understand. The upper middle class. This is typically a monthly income of around about 12 to 18,000 Malaysian ringgit. And this is typically reserved for the highly educated, the white collar professionals with advanced post-secondary education. Then you've got the lower middle class. This is the semi-professionals and craftsmen with some work autonomy, independence, and some have a college education. And typically they might have an income between 3 and 6,000 Malaysian ringgit per month. When it comes to the working class, they have a monthly income of around about 2 to 4,000. And these jobs are considered to be routine with low economic security. And unfortunately, important occupations such as law enforcement, healthcare providers such as nurses, fall into that category. Then you've got the underclass. And the underclass has an income of less than 1,200 Malaysian ringgit per month. Some of the incomes in Malaysia, monthly income households, and these stats are a little bit old, between 2014 and 2016, nothing else available currently. However, I'm sure the monthly income in the COVID-19 pandemic has become less. But according to this pie chart, typically here now, the greatest percentage, 29.4%, is around about 1 to 2 thousand per month. In relation to specific ethnic groups in Malaysia, who earns the most? Well, typically here now we can see, obviously, it must be related to the Chinese households. When it comes to education expenditure, it seems to be tertiary education, universities, that ends up having more money contributed. What are the global comparisons in relation to income? High income countries are considered to be the United States of America, the United Kingdom, Canada, Singapore, Australia, Brunei, Hong Kong, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. The low income countries are considered to be Nepal, Malawi, Afghanistan, Haiti, North Korea, Madagascar, Somalia, Uganda. Middle income countries, China, Iran, Iraq, Mexico, Thailand, and then other countries such as Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, Myanmar, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Vietnam. Where do you think Malaysia fits in? What are some of the concerns that Malaysians have in relation to the future? Cost of living going up, salaries not. Salaries don't match inflation. Malaysia's middle class may be decreasing, with some falling into poverty. And that might be an issue with the COVID pandemic. Being middle class in 2020 no longer means living as secure as compared to 20 years ago. When it comes to world systems theory, this is a theory that was developed by Emmanuel Wallerstein. He's another Manny. in the 1970s. And he basically said countries are politically and economically tied together. Wealthy countries benefit from other countries because they exploit those countries and their citizens. Countries fit into three categories. They're referred to as core, semi-peripheral, or peripheral. They're the main categories. Core countries seem to be mainly the Western countries, such as the United States of America, England, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada. So, what are core countries or nations? Well, core nations are considered to be the dominant countries, the capitalist countries. And they're characterised by high levels of industrialisation and urbanisation. They're powerful and they're wealthy. And more often, they're in the forefront of new technologies and have new industries. They have a strong military presence. They're powerful. They have a high level of education. And typically, they exploit the rest of the world. What are the benefits of being a core nation? Well, they control world trade and economic agreements. They go to countries and extract raw materials at very little cost. They can also set prices for the agricultural products that peripheral countries export regardless of market prices. Examples of these countries, as I said, are the United States of America, Japan, Germany, most of Europe, and China. What then are semi-peripheral nations? Well, these are the less developed nations. They're less developed than the core nations, but more developed than the peripheral nations. They're highly dependent on trade with core nations as not being dominant in international trade. They export more to peripheral nations and import more from core nations in trade. They're typically emerging markets. They have some wealth, but they also have poverty. Semi-peripheral nations are exploited by core nations, but they in turn exploit peripheral countries. Examples of semi-peripheral nations are South Korea, Taiwan, Mexico, Brazil, India, Nigeria, and South Africa. The last are the peripheral nations, and these are typically underdeveloped countries. They're dependent on core countries for money, capital, because of their underdeveloped industries. They're exploited for raw materials, copper, coal, whatever vegetation that they have. They're mainly limited to selling cash crops to core nations with limited economic development or farming. They're poor countries. They have raw materials, cheap labour, and they will have emerging markets. Peripheral nations, they provide labour and materials to core countries, as we indicated. They have a low literacy rate and lack internet access. They have weak governments and they're less industrialised. They have high social inequality. Examples of a peripheral nation are Eastern Europe, some African countries, and low-income countries which are located in South America. That's the theory of world systems: core, semi-peripheral, and peripheral nations. And in 2020, the categories basically remain the same. even though the colouring scheme isn't quite as good here, the advanced economies are the darker, which hasn't really changed. Where does Malaysia fit in? It's in the orangey brown colour, which means emerging and developing economies. So, think about this. Malaysia is rich in natural resources such as petroleum, timber and gold. And natural gas, from what I believe. It's an industrialised country with a high education level. So should Malaysia be classified as a core, semi-peripheral or peripheral country? In the literature, I haven't been able to find, but I have my own opinions. What's your opinion and why do you think that? You reflect. Now, let's look at social mobility. Social mobility is the movement of individuals and families or households from one social class to another. It can be up or it can be down. And it describes changes that occur with income, which is your wealth, your social status, or your education. Higher social mobility, lower social mobility. Higher is upward mobility, lower is downward mobility. As the cartoon indicates, social mobility can go up as well as go down. What are some of the types of social mobility? You've got essentially four: horizontal, vertical, intra-generation or territorial. When we look at horizontal social mobility, which one is it? A or B? Well, horizontal, as we've indicated with other things, is flat, so it must be A. When we look at horizontal social mobility, this is a change in position at the same social level. Place is changed, but social position remains on the same level. The place is changed, but the social position remains on the same level. This is vertical social mobility. Which one? A or B? It's B. Vertical social mobility means there's a change in position between the social levels. And as a consequence of that, it changes in status of an individual. Upward mobility in this case. Downward mobility in this case. When we talk about intra-generational social mobility, this is a change in social position that occurs over multiple generations. Lower, upward mobility, downward mobility. With intra-generational mobility, there's a change in social status within the same generation. Lower, upward. When we look at territorial social mobility, this is a change in locality or territory, when an individual moves from one place to another. Okay, here's a class activity for you. Which social mobility is being purported here? The son of a farmer graduates with a university degree and becomes a successful advocate and lawyer. This is upward social mobility, and it's intra-generational. Which social mobility? An American entrepreneur and businessman, Bernie Madoff, was a rich and powerful Wall Street executive, and then, because of certain bad dealings, he was sentenced to prison. Which social mobility? Downward vertical mobility. Which social mobility here? A teacher who leaves one school to take the same position as a teacher at another school. Which social mobility? Horizontal. Which social mobility? Michelle moves to a new house in Kuching, Sarawak, and rents her house in the UK, the United Kingdom. Which social mobility? Territorial mobility. Which social mobility? Farah, a nurse, marries a datuk and becomes a datin. Upward vertical mobility is the social mobility in this situation. Which social mobility? A clerk who accepts the same position at another company. Horizontal, correct. Okay. Which social mobility? The son of a Dato Shri becomes an Uber driver. This would be downward intra-generational mobility. If we correlate social mobility and social systems, then we can see that there are two systems. Open systems that allow social mobility, closed systems forbid social mobility. So when we look at open systems and social mobility, with the right opportunities, individuals have the ability to move up in society and become a member of a different social class. It's not fixed with a social status, with which individuals are born into. Gee, that's a lot of money. Winning 344 million. Wow. When we look at closed systems, social mobility is restricted. It's forbidden. The example that we looked at before was in India, which has a complex and fixed caste system. No social mobility is allowed. People are born, live and die within the same caste. Intermarrying and crossing into a new caste is prohibited, with serious consequences. Social mobility in Malaysia. Let's have a look. Malaysian upward social mobility. How do you achieve that? Hard work. Hard work is the key to upward mobility. Remember that. Malaysian upward mobility. Be aware. In 2016, 74% of children raised in the lowest social class have risen at least one social class higher than their parents. That's what parents want for their children. To do better than them. Remember that. Work hard. Work smart. Malaysian upward mobility. 63% of Malaysian adults are better educated than their parents. Let's hope so. Malaysian upward mobility. 76% of children with low-skilled parents are better skilled. That's your objective. 50% of children earn a higher income than their parents. Their parents would be very proud and very thankful. Less than 19% of an individual's income is supplemented by their parents. Upward mobility is more prominent amongst ethnic Chinese, followed by the Bumi, Puteras, and the Indians, as far as ethnic groups go. What are some of the contributing factors for Malaysians' upward mobility success? Children of parents with savings are more likely to climb up the social mobility ladder. Children brought up in urban or city areas are more likely to succeed and earn more than in the rural areas. Males were more likely to earn more than girls. What about Malaysian downward mobility? Children raised by a single parent are more likely to earn less than their parents. Children from middle income and high income families are more likely to move down or earn less than their parents. So in conclusion, I'll quote Bernie Sanders, who is a very clever economist in the United States of America. A nation will not, well, that's survive. That's not written correctly. A nation will not survive morally or economically when so few have so much while so many have so little. Now that's not just in Malaysia, that's in every country in the world. Because in a capitalist country, that's the philosophy. However, I'm certain that it also exists in communist and socialist countries. Because the more powerful that you are, the more opportunities that you have. To quote Pope Francis, inequality is the root of all social evil. Okay, that concludes this session. Thanks again for your participation and interest. If you've got any interests in other of my Learnshops, have a look. They're all on YouTube.